The blade rested against the stone wall of the inn, its leather-wrapped hilt worn smooth by generations of hands. Sir Gareth Thornwell watched it from his bed, the familiar warmth radiating from the steel even in its scabbard. 3 nights without true sleep had left his eyes red-rimmed, his thoughts scattered like autumn leaves. The sword had been calling to him again, not with words, but with visions that bled into the space between waking and dreaming. He'd inherited the weapon 6 months ago from Sir Aldrich Brennan, a man who'd seemed ancient at 37. Gareth remembered the ceremony in the chapter house of the Silver Rose, how Aldrich's hands had trembled as he passed the sword across the marble table. The older knight's eyes had held something Gareth now recognized. Not wisdom, but exhaustion so profound it had carved valleys into his face. "She serve you well," Aldrich had whispered, his voice like wind through dead branches. "She always has." 3 weeks later, Aldrich was dead. Heart failure, the chirurgeon said. He was 38. Gareth rose from the bed, his muscles aching despite the brief rest. The inn-room in Millhaven was modest, rough-hewn timber walls. A small window overlooking the market square, the scent of baking bread drifting up from below. Morning light filtered through the shutters, painting stripes across the floorboards. He could hear the town waking, merchants calling out their wares, cartwheels clattering over cobblestones, children laughing as they chased each other between the stalls. Normal sounds. A normal day. Yet the sword thrummed with barely contained heat. He'd first noticed the weapon's peculiarities within days of receiving it. Sleep, once a refuge, had become something else entirely. When exhaustion finally dragged him under, his dreams transformed into something vivid and terrible. Visions of places he'd never been, people he'd never met. 2 nights ago, he'd dreamed of a burning village to the east. Yesterday, riders from Thornmarch had arrived with news. Bandits had torched 3 farmsteads along the eastern road. The sword had warned him. He'd been too slow to understand. Gareth buckled his belt, feeling the weapon's weight settle against his hip. The leather was cool against his palm, but beneath it, the metal pulsed with subtle warmth. Not uncomfortable, never uncomfortable. That was part of the problem. The sword felt right, like an extension of his arm, his will. It had felt that way from the first moment he'd drawn it. He descended the stairs to find the common room already bustling. Farmers and traders occupied most of the tables, their conversations a low rumble punctuated by the clatter of wooden bowls and pewter cups. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Marjorie, with flour dusted across her apron, caught his eye and nodded toward a corner table where breakfast waited. As Gareth ate, brown bread, hard cheese, dried apples, he pulled a leather journal from his pack. He'd started keeping it a month ago, after the dreams had intensified. The pages were filled with dates, names, and sketchy drawings. A pattern had emerged, one that made his stomach clench. Sir Aldrich Brennan, 38 years, 17 months as bearer. Dame Helena Greystone, 36 years, 2 years and 3 months as bearer. Sir Marcus Voltaire, 39 years, 3 years as bearer. Sir Edmund Blackwood, 37 years, 14 months as bearer. He traced back 7 generations as far as the chapter house records allowed. Not one bearer had lived past 40. Not one had carried the sword for more than 4 years. The longest serving had been Dame Helena, who'd supposedly possessed an iron constitution. She'd collapsed during a tournament, her heart simply stopping mid-charge. Gareth was 29. If the pattern held, he had perhaps a decade. Less, if the sword's demands accelerated. The blade grew warmer against his leg. He looked up sharply, scanning the common room. Everything appeared normal. Merchants arguing good-naturedly over grain prices, a mother wiping porridge from her toddler's face, 2 old men bent over a game of tiles. Yet the sword insisted. Danger approached. Then he saw her. The woman stood in the doorway, framed by morning light. She wore traveling leathers and a cloak the color of smoke, her dark hair bound in a practical braid. What struck Gareth wasn't her appearance, though she was striking with sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing, but the way she looked at him, or rather at the sword. She crossed the room with deliberate steps, ignoring Marjorie's offer of breakfast, and stopped at his table. "Sir Gareth Thornwell," she said. Not a question. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't. My name is Lyra Ashenmore. I'm a scholar of antiquities, specializing in enchanted artifacts of the Third Age." She gestured to the empty chair. "May I?" Gareth nodded, his hand instinctively moving toward the sword's hilt. The blade's warmth hadn't diminished. If anything, it had intensified. Lyra sat, folding her hands on the table. Her fingers were ink-stained, her nails trimmed short. I've been tracking that sword for 2 years. I know what it does to its bearers. I know what it's doing to you. Then you know more than I do. I doubt that. You've noticed the sleeplessness, the visions, the way it grows warm in the presence of danger. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. You've probably also started keeping records. You're intelligent enough to see the pattern in the deaths. Gareth said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Lyra leaned forward slightly. That sword was forged during the Dissolution Wars when the College of Binding Arts still existed. It was never meant to be a weapon of war, Sir Gareth. It was created as a sentinel, a guardian that would never tire, never sleep, never miss a threat. She paused. The enchanters bound a fragment of a watcher spirit into the steel. The spirit doesn't sleep. It can't, and neither can anyone who carries the blade. I sleep, Gareth said. Do you? Truly? Lyra's expression softened slightly. Or do you merely close your eyes while the spirit shows you what it sees? Threats real and imagined, scattered across the realm. The sword isn't granting you visions, Sir Gareth. It's sharing its eternal vigil. And human minds weren't built to sustain that burden. The common room seemed to fade, the noise dimming to a distant murmur. Gareth's mouth had gone dry. How long do I have? That depends on how strong you are. Some lasted years, others months. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers, spreading them across the table. Sketches, diagrams, pages of dense script in multiple languages. I've devoted my life to studying cursed artifacts. This sword has killed 16 people that I can confirm. Probably more before records became reliable. Then why would anyone carry it? Because it works, Lyra said simply. Every bearer became a legendary knight. They saved villages, stopped invasions, uncovered assassination plots before they could unfold. The sword makes its bearer nearly impossible to surprise, almost prescient in battle. For a time, they become the perfect guardian. Her voice dropped. Until the price comes due. Gareth stared at the papers, at the genealogy of death she'd compiled. Why are you telling me this? Because I believe there's a way to break the binding without destroying the blade's spirit. The original enchanters were rushed, desperate. The Dissolution Wars were in their final desperate phase. They made the binding permanent, but unstable. If we could find the original forging site, access the anchoring runes... She trailed off, studying his face. You don't believe me. I believe you think it's possible. I've spent 2 years researching this, Sir Gareth. I'm not offering you false hope. The sword pulsed with heat against his leg, almost painful now. Gareth stood abruptly, his hand going to the hilt. Across the common room, the door burst open. A young man stumbled through, his clothes torn, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. Raiders, he gasped. On the northern road. They're coming for the town. The room erupted into chaos. Gareth was already moving, his exhaustion forgotten as training took over. The sword sang as he drew it, the sound like wind through a canyon. The blade itself was unremarkable. Good steel, well-balanced, with a crossguard shaped like spread wings. But in his hand it felt alive, anticipatory. How many? He demanded, catching the wounded messenger before he could collapse. Doesn't, maybe more, the young man wheezed. They hit the Merrick farm at dawn. Killed the father, took the daughter. Moving this way. Marjorie was already herding people toward the back of the inn, her voice sharp with authority. Everyone who can't fight, into the cellars. Bar the doors. Move! Gareth turned to find Lyra still seated, calmly rolling up her papers. You should go with them. I didn't come all this way to hide in a cellar. She stood, revealing a short sword belted at her waist. I can handle myself. There was no time to argue. Gareth strode toward the door, calling out to the able-bodied men gathering in the square. Within minutes, he'd organized them into something resembling a defensive formation, farmers and craftsmen, most with nothing more than pitchforks and wood axes, but determined nonetheless. The sword showed him where to place them. Not through words or visions, but through instinct so sharp it felt like prophecy. He knew without knowing how he knew that the raiders would approach from the northwest, that they'd try to flank through the cooper's workshop, that their leader would ride a gray horse with a white blaze. When the raiders appeared, cresting the hill beyond the town's edge exactly as the sword had predicted, Gareth felt that familiar duality, triumph and dread intertwined. The blade was never wrong. That was the blessing and the curse. There were 15 of them, mounted and armed with an eclectic mix of weapons. Stolen swords, hunting spears, one man carrying a military crossbow that had probably been pried from a soldier's dead fingers. They wore no uniform, just mismatched leather and mail, but they moved with the casual confidence of men who'd done this before. Their leader was exactly as Gareth had foreseen, a scarred brute on a gray horse, his smile visible even at this distance. "Stand down," Gareth called out, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Leave now, and no one else dies today." The raider chief laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Fancy sword you've got there, knight? We'll take good care of it after we pry it from your corpse." The attack came swift and brutal. The raiders charged, expecting the townspeople to scatter. Instead, Gareth had positioned his defenders in a tight formation near the bottleneck between two buildings, exactly where the narrow approach would negate the raiders' numbers. The sword guided every movement. Gareth parried a spear thrust without looking, the blade moving on its own accord. He felt the raider behind him before he heard the footstep, spinning to deflect a sword strike that would have taken his head. The fight became a dance, his body responding to threats before his conscious mind could process them. Within minutes, 5 raiders lay dead or dying. The rest pulled back, their confidence shattered. Even their leader looked uncertain now, his gray horse sidling nervously. "She warned you about that, didn't she?" Lyra's voice came from beside him. She'd fought alongside the townsmen, her blade bloodied, but her breathing steady. "The prescience in battle. It's intoxicating," Gareth didn't answer. He was watching the raiders regroup, knowing with absolute certainty that they'd try one more charge, that the crossbowman would aim for his chest, that the leader would attempt to ride him down from the left. "They're going to attack again," he said quietly. "How do you—" Lyra stopped herself. "The sword told you, it always does." The second charge was desperate, savage. The crossbow bolt flew exactly as predicted. Gareth deflected it with his blade, the bolt sparking off steel and burying itself in a wooden beam behind him. The leader came from the left, his sword raised high. But Gareth was already moving, his blade finding the gap in the man's armor with surgical precision. The raider chief fell. The remaining attackers broke, fleeing back toward the hills. The townspeople erupted in cheers, clapping Gareth on the shoulders, offering him ale and food and a hero's welcome. He'd barely hurt them. The sword was still warm against his palm, satisfied. Fed that night, after the wounded had been tended and the dead raiders buried in unmarked graves beyond the town, Gareth sat in his room with Lyra. She'd spread her research across the bed. Maps, translations of ancient texts, letters from scholars across the continent. The forging site was called Sentinel's Rest, she explained, pointing to a notation in a crumbling journal. It was hidden in the Ashmark Mountains, accessible only during the autumn months when the passes weren't snowbound. The College of Binding Arts destroyed most of their facilities before the final dissolution, but this one, I think it might still exist. How far? 2 weeks hard ride, through some of the most dangerous terrain in the realm. She met his eyes. The sword will keep you alive. That's not the question. What is the question? Whether you'll still be you when we get there. Gareth looked down at his hands. They were steady, unshaking despite the battle, despite the lack of sleep. I closed my eyes for what felt like hours last night. But I remember everything, every sound in the inn, every person who walked past the door, a dog barking 3 streets away. He swallowed hard. You're right. I'm not sleeping. I'm watching. Always watching. The spirit shares its burden with you. Over time, the boundary between your consciousness and its eternal vigil erodes. Lyra's voice was gentle but firm. Eventually, there is no separation. You become the sword's vessel entirely. That's when the body fails, when there's nothing left of the person who first took up the blade. Sir Aldrich, Gareth said quietly. He barely recognized me at the end. His last words weren't his own. He kept talking about threats to the east. Movements in the shadow, like he was reporting to some unseen commander. The spirit's nature asserting itself. Once a watcher, always a watcher. Gareth stood, moving to the window. Outside, Millhaven was settling into night. Lanterns flickered in windows, families gathering for evening meals, children being tucked into bed. Normal life, continuing as it always had. Below, he could sense movement. A drunk stumbling home, a cat hunting rats near the granary, two young lovers stealing a kiss in an alley. The sword showed him everything. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "The Sentinel's Rest?" "That's why I'm here," Lyra said. They departed Millhaven at dawn, taking the old shepherd's trail that wound into the foothills of the Ashmark Range. Gareth rode a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, while Lyra preferred a smaller, nimble mare suited to mountain paths. The sword hung at Gareth's side, its presence a constant weight, physical and otherwise. The first 3 days passed without incident. They traveled through autumn-touched forests where golden leaves carpeted the ground and morning frost crystallized on spider webs. Lyra proved to be unexpectedly easy company, filling the silence with stories of her research, the obscure archives she'd explored, the cranky librarians she'd charmed or argued into submission. "You never said why you started studying cursed artifacts?" Gareth said on the 4th evening as they made camp beside a rushing stream. Lyra was quiet for a moment, arranging kindling for their fire. "My brother," she said finally. "He was a knight, like you. He found a helmet, ancient thing, beautiful craftsmanship. It whispered to him, promised glory in battle." She struck flint to steel, coaxing flame from the tinder. "It took his mind slowly. By the end, he didn't recognize our mother. Didn't know his own name. He died thinking he was some long-dead general, still fighting wars that ended centuries ago. I'm sorry. So am I." The fire caught, casting dancing shadows across her face. "I spent years being angry at him for taking it, at the knights who didn't stop him, at the ancient bastards who made the thing in the first place. Then I realized anger wasn't enough. I needed to understand. If I could learn how these artifacts worked, maybe I could save the next person being me, among others." She managed a slight smile. "You're not my first rescue attempt. You are, however, the first one who actually listened instead of insisting the artifact was different or worth the risk." Gareth touched the sword's hilt, feeling its ever-present warmth. "Hard to argue when the evidence is carved into my face. I looked in a mirror this morning. I'm starting to look like Aldrich did, older, worn thin. How's your sleep?" "What sleep?" The words came out sharper than intended. I lie down, close my eyes, and the visions come. Last night I watched a wolf pack hunting deer 40 miles from here. I felt the ground shake from a distant rock slide. I knew the exact moment that merchant caravan crested the eastern ridge, though I never saw them." He looked at her. "The sword doesn't just warn about dangers anymore. It shows me everything. All the time. The boundary is eroding faster than I expected," Lyra said quietly. "We need to reach Sentinel's Rest soon." They pushed harder the next day, climbing higher into the mountains where the air grew thin and cold. The trees gave way to scrub brush and eventually bare rock, the path becoming treacherous with loose stones and sudden drops. The sword guided Gareth unerringly, warning him of unstable ground before his horse could stumble, alerting him to falling stones before they clattered down from above. It saved his life a dozen times in a single day. It was also killing him, piece by piece. On the 7th day, they encountered their first real obstacle, a mountain pass blocked by a recent landslide. Tons of rock and debris had obliterated the path, leaving only a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a person on foot, let alone horses. "We'll have to leave them," Lyra said, studying the obstacle. "Lead them back down to the tree line, hobble them there. We continue on foot." Gareth was about to agree when the sword grew suddenly intensely hot. Not warm, burning. He gasped, his hand flying to the hilt, and in that moment the visions crashed over him like a wave. He saw through the sword's perception, felt what it felt, danger. Not here, but close, very close. Men hiding among the rocks above, crossbows aimed at the narrow ledge. An ambush. "Get down." He grabbed Lyra and pulled her behind a boulder just as the first bolt sang through the air, striking stone where they'd been standing. 6 men emerged from concealment, all armed, all moving with military precision. Not bandits. These were trained soldiers. Mercenaries, perhaps, or deserters. The sword showed Gareth their positions, their angles of attack, the one with a wounded leg who would be slower to react. "They've been tracking us," Lyra said, drawing her blade. "Someone doesn't want us reaching Sentinel's Rest, or someone wants the sword." The fight was brutal and close. Gareth moved like water, the blade an extension of his will. He parried attacks he couldn't see, struck at openings before they appeared, flowed through the ambush like a dancer performing a choreographed routine. 2 men fell quickly. The others grew cautious, spreading out, trying to flank. But the sword knew. It always knew. When the last attacker fell, Gareth stood among the bodies, his blade clean. He'd wiped it on a dead man's cloak without thinking. His breathing was steady. He wasn't even tired. That was when he realized the truth. "Lyra," he said quietly. "I didn't feel it." "Feel what?" "Anything. The fear, the adrenaline, the humanness of fighting for my life." He looked down at his hands. They were steady, utterly calm. "I just killed 6 men, and all I feel is satisfaction." "The sword is satisfied." Lyra's face had gone pale. "The final stage. You're not just sharing the spirit's vigil anymore, Gareth. You're starting to share its nature. Watchers don't feel fear or regret. They only fulfill their function. How long do I have?" "I don't know, days maybe. We're close to Sentinel's Rest. Another 2 days climb." "But Gareth," she stepped closer, her voice urgent. "When we get there, you need to let go of the sword. Immediately, don't hesitate, don't second guess. The binding ritual I've researched requires the bearer to willingly release the blade. If you've merged too deeply with the spirit by then, I won't be able to let go," Gareth finished. Exactly. They climbed through the afternoon and into evening, leaving the horses and most of their supplies cached in a sheltered hollow. The path grew steeper, more treacherous. Snow began to fall, fat, lazy flakes that clung to their cloaks and obscured the trail. The sword guided them unerringly through the whiteout. As night fell, they found themselves on a narrow plateau, and there, half buried in drifted snow, stood the ruins of Sentinel's Rest. The structure was unlike anything Gareth had expected, not a forge or workshop, but something closer to a temple. Massive stone pillars thrust up from the mountainside, carved with spiraling runes that seemed to shift in the firelight when Lyra lit a torch. Between the pillars, a circular platform of black stone bore an intricate pattern of inlaid silver, tarnished but still visible. "The binding circle," Lyra breathed, brushing snow from the ancient metal. "It's intact." "Gareth, this might actually work," but Gareth wasn't listening. He stood at the center of the circle, his hand on the sword's hilt, and for the first time in months, he felt something like peace. The visions had stopped. The constant watching, the eternal vigil. Here, in this place where the sword had been born, everything was still. "It's quiet," he whispered. Lyra turned, and her expression shifted from excitement to alarm. "Gareth? Talk to me. What do you mean, quiet?" "The sword. I can't hear it anymore. Can't feel it watching." He drew the blade, holding it up to catch the torchlight. The steel gleamed, pristine and beautiful. "It's just a sword." "No." Lyra moved toward him slowly, carefully, like approaching a spooked horse. "That's not possible. The binding doesn't just stop, unless—" Her eyes widened. "Unless you fully merged with the spirit. Gareth, what you're feeling isn't silence, it's unity. You and the Watcher have become one consciousness." Gareth looked at her, and his face was serene. "Then maybe that's not such a terrible thing. I saved Millhaven. I got us through the ambush. The sword has kept me alive, kept others alive. Perhaps the price is worth paying. Listen to yourself." "That's not you talking, that's the spirit's logic. A Watcher doesn't value life or death, only the continuation of its function." Lyra's voice cracked with desperation. "Your name is Gareth Thornwell. You're 29 years old. You have a sister in Kingsreach who writes you letters you pretend to find annoying. You hate carrots. You sing when you think no one can hear. You're a person, Gareth, not a tool." For a moment, just a heartbeat. Something flickered in Gareth's eyes. Confusion. Recognition. The sword trembled in his hand. Then the moment passed. "You should go," he said, his voice gentle but empty. "I need to complete the ritual." "There is no completion," Lyra shouted. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. The ritual I researched isn't about strengthening the bond. It's about severing it. But you have to choose to let go, Gareth. You have to want to be free." "Free?" Gareth's smile was sad. "I haven't been free since I picked up this blade. None of us are free. We just choose our chains." He raised the sword, and Lyra saw his intention a heartbeat before he acted. The blade came down not toward her, but toward the binding circle's center, where a dark seam marked the pattern's focal point. He meant to complete the original enchantment, to seal the bond permanently. She did the only thing she could think of. She ran forward and grabbed the blade with her bare hands. Pain exploded through Lyra's palms as the steel bit deep, her blood running hot over the silver inlay. She screamed but didn't let go, and in that moment of contact, something extraordinary happened. The sword's consciousness, vast and ancient and utterly inhuman, touched her mind. She felt its perspective, the eternal watching, the tireless vigilance, the thousand threats catalogued and analyzed across centuries. It was beautiful and terrible, a purpose so pure it burned like a star. And she felt Gareth within it, drowning. "I see you," she gasped, her blood painting the binding circle's runes. "I see what you are. You're not evil, you're just doing what you were made to do, but he's not your tool. He's a person, and I won't let you take him." The Watcher spirit regarded her with something like curiosity. It had never been challenged before. The bearers had always fallen, always merged, always been consumed. This was different. Gareth stood frozen, the sword trembling between them. Through their shared contact with the blade, Lyra could feel him struggling, his consciousness fighting to the surface like a drowning man clawing toward light. "Remember," she whispered, not sure if she was speaking to Gareth or the spirit or both. "Remember who you were. Remember what you wanted beyond survival and duty. Remember music. Remember laughter. Remember the taste of good wine and the smell of rain and the feeling of sun on your face. Remember being human." The sword grew burning hot. Lyra's blood sizzled against the steel, and the binding circle beneath them began to glow. Ancient magic awakening. The runes shifted, reconfiguring themselves, not completing the original pattern, but forming something new. Gareth gasped as if surfacing from deep water. His eyes cleared, focusing on Lyra's bloodied hands, her determined expression. "Lyra, let it go," she said firmly. "Right now. Let the sword go." I can't. My hands won't, not your hands. You. The part of you that's merged with the spirit. You have to choose yourself, Gareth. You have to choose to be separate, to be limited, to be human again. Even if it hurts. Even if it means being vulnerable. The Watcher spirit surged within the blade, fighting against the possibility of separation. It had never been alone, never existed without a bearer to fulfill its purpose. The thought of returning to dormancy, to the silent dark of unsheathed steel, was unbearable. But Gareth understood something in that moment that no previous bearer had grasped. The spirit wasn't evil, it was afraid. Afraid of abandonment, of purposelessness, of the ending of its eternal watch. "I release you," he said quietly. "Not to Lyra, but to the sword. Not forever. Just for now. You've served faithfully for centuries. You deserve rest." The blade went cold in his hands, truly cold, for the first time since he'd taken it up. The visions ceased. The watching stopped. Gareth felt a rushing sensation, like blood returning to a numbed limb, as his consciousness pulled back from the spirit's vast awareness. He was alone in his own head. The silence was deafening. The binding circle's glow intensified, and then, with a sound like a bell tolling across mountains, the runes completed their new pattern. The sword fell from Gareth's nerveless fingers, clattering onto the black stone. Where it landed, the silver inlay formed a perfect sheath. Not a prison, but a sanctuary. Lyra collapsed, her hands still bleeding. Gareth caught her, lowering her gently to the stone. "You're insane," he said, his voice shaking. "You could have died. Worth it," she managed, though her face was pale with pain and blood loss. Had to show it. Another way. Gareth tore strips from his cloak, binding her hands as gently as he could. The cuts were deep but clean. She'd be scarred, but she'd survive. As he worked, he felt truly exhausted for the first time in months. His hands trembled. His vision blurred with fatigue. His mind held only his own thoughts, his own fears, his own hopes. It was the most beautiful feeling in the world. The sword lay in its silver sheath, dormant but not destroyed. Gareth could sense it still, a distant awareness like a far-off candle in the dark. The connection hadn't been severed entirely, but it had been transformed. No longer a parasitic binding, but something closer to partnership. He could take it up again if needed, but it would no longer consume him. "What you did," he said to Lyra, "modifying the binding circle with your blood. That wasn't in any of your research, was it?" She smiled weakly. Pure improvisation. I read about blood binding in certain northern traditions. Thought it might create a third point of connection. You, the spirit, and someone outside the bond. Gamble of a lifetime. You could have told me the plan. You would have tried to stop me. She was right, of course. They rested in the ruins until dawn, Gareth keeping watch the old-fashioned way, with his own eyes, his own instincts, his own fallible human awareness. When the sun rose over the ash-marked peaks, painting the snow gold and crimson, he helped Lyra to her feet. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the sword, I mean." Gareth looked at the blade, still resting in its silver cradle. "I'll take it back to the chapter house. Tell them what we discovered. They'll need to change how it's passed on, assuming anyone's willing to carry it knowing the truth. And you? I don't know." Gareth flexed his hands, feeling the ache in his muscles, the fog of exhaustion in his mind. All the sensations he'd lost were rushing back, pain and fatigue and hunger and cold. They were miserable. They were glorious. For the first time in months, I actually don't know what happens next. I can't see the future, can't predict every threat. I'm just me. That's usually considered a good thing. It is. It really is. They made the descent slowly, Gareth's muscles protesting after days of being sustained by the sword's energy. The world seemed different now, smaller, more manageable, less crystalline in its clarity. He couldn't sense the deer in the valley or the hawk circling overhead. He was just a man walking down a mountain with a friend, cold and tired and utterly, completely alive. When they reached the tree line where they'd left the horses, they found the animals waiting patiently, along with something unexpected. A small wooden marker driven into the ground, carved with the symbol of the silver rose. "Aldrich," Gareth said, running his fingers over the weathered wood. "He made it this far. Probably trying to do what we just did, find a way to break free. He didn't have someone to catch him," Lyra said softly. "No, he didn't." Gareth mounted Copper, feeling the sword's weight at his side, present but quiet, a tool rather than a master. In time, he might take it up again for a worthy cause. Or perhaps he'd find a way to pass it to someone else under the new binding, with full knowledge of both the gift and the cost. For now, though, he was simply Sir Gareth Thornwell, 29 years old, exhausted and scarred and free. As they rode back toward Millhaven, Lyra asked, "Do you still remember the visions?" "What the sword showed you, some of them. They're fading already, like dreams." He paused, considering. "But I remember the important part. The spirit wasn't trying to hurt us. It was just doing what it was made to do. Watch, warn, protect. It thought consuming us was necessary. Maybe it took you showing both of us another possibility to realize there might be a different way." "Heroism with boundaries," Lyra mused. "Revolutionary concept." Gareth laughed. Actually laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Somewhere behind them, buried in snow and stone and silver, the sword that never sleeps rested in its sanctuary. Still watchful, still waiting, but no longer desperate, no longer devouring. Just a sword and a spirit, learning together what it meant to let someone go. The first stars were emerging as they reached the valley floor, and for the first time in half a year, Gareth looked forward to closing his eyes without fear of what he might see. He looked forward to sleep,